therefore I need to pick this up, and there's some redundancy here. The anomaly that I was addressing was concerned with the means ends. What I'd like to emphasize is that the mechanistic model, or the mechanistic paradigm, deals with what is, essentially. It deals with the problem of efficient causation. And from the point of view of ethics or morality, it is amoral or neutral. It does not deal with the judgmental issues of whether it is good or bad. This is simply what is. That, in dealing with particularly human behavior or some of the other phenomena that we're concerned with in education, does not deal with the ought question, what ought to be. Again, let me illustrate this with Skinner's model. And Skinner is very explicit in his own characterization of this, is that he has a technology, a set of techniques under the operant and respondent conditioning model that he has, of being able to create the good reader. But it is a far cry from being able to use those procedures to create the good man. He himself characterizes this as his techniques can be used by a saint or a sinner. I think we had some naturalistic experiments in the Korean War where this was policy. They used essentially the Skinnerian techniques for what we call brainwashing the American soldiers into a new ideology. When we use that in terms of our working with youngsters in some of our special education programs, that is a major concern for us, is dealing with are we the saints or the sinners? Again, it becomes a question of perspective. But the theory itself, again, cannot deal and does not deal with the ought issue. This is one of the anomalies of the mechanistic paradigm. Kohlberg notes what he calls the psychologist's fallacy. A great deal of research has been conducted in developmental psychology, which gives us descriptive information about how youngsters function at given ages. I think this is, we were referring to this from normative tests. What Kohlberg calls the psychologist's fallacy is because this is, therefore it ought to be, because these are the developmental milestones for a given age, we then somewhat reify this, and therefore this ought to be. And he calls it a psychologist's fallacy, and I tend to agree with it. Therefore, if we're using such as the Skinnerian model as a basis for educational practice, it is essentially descriptive. And it cannot deal with the ought issues. One thing that Dan's model does is it is a prescriptive theory. It prescribes. It tells you what the nature of man ought to be. It deals with final cause. It deals with purpose. And this is an anomaly now that the mechanistic paradigm simply cannot deal with. Okay. Now, anomalies, as you can see, as we've been discussing them, lead to theoretical crisis. Now, let me tie together some threads here to try to show how the Anisa-Model deals with some of the anomalies that I've been referring to. And let me start right back with some of the presuppositions. My thesis is that Dan has, with the creation of the Anisa-Model, moved education out of its philosophical or pre-paradigm stage into a paradigm stage of development, at least when it's contrasted with the mechanistic paradigm. Because as I noted before, if there is any paradigm that exists in education that is a paradigm, can claim the status of a paradigm according to Kuhn, it is the mechanistic paradigm that dominates in evaluation and dominates particularly where learning theory, particularly the Skinnerian theory, is being used. The presuppositions, as I noted before, under the mechanistic is that the universe is a machine. And if you put it in real metaphorical terms, as most science does, is X behaves as if it were Y. And that is the connection that has happened with the mechanistic. Man behaves as if he is a machine. And we have the concept of man being reactive, the robot notion. And he is simply reactive to external forces, which we call efficient cause. That's the underlying presupposition of that mechanistic paradigm. Now, what are the underlying presuppositions of the Anisa? The metaphor, the basic metaphor for Dan's model, or the organismic approach, is the organism, a living, organized structure. And what Dan has done is, in his presuppositions, he has not only dealt with how nature operates, but he has dealt essentially with the problem of the nature of man, including the nature of man. And his presuppositions, basic underlying presuppositions, is related to that bedrock first principle of change. And change presupposing potentiality, and potentiality and the release of that potentiality into actuality, which operates at all levels, assuming the universe is hierarchically organized and incorporates the nature of man. Now, those presuppositions, that metaphor of living organism, and the first principles, gives us now, at least as I see it, for the first time, a basic notion of the nature of reality which educators can agree upon. And that's a key to moving us out of that philosophical or just the theoretical schools of thought. Now, those who have been working within that organismic view, and I've mentioned a few, Werner, Piaget, but they have, to a large extent, been independent theoretical schools of development. What Dan has done has taken this as organized knowledge and codified it in a way that I believe represents a new paradigm. Now, if you have a new paradigm, a paradigm is more than a group of individuals, a cohort of individuals agreeing upon how nature works, and then working in that vineyard. It also presupposes, as I noted before, some exemplar, some outstanding scientific achievement that is the basis for practice. And here I refer to it as the grand discovery. And my view of the exemplar in the Anisa framework is learning. let me put this in some perspective. Dan drawing on Whitehead, bridging that Eastern and Western thought. Dan characterizes it this way. Western thought, and the mechanistic notion to a large extent, is trying to understand what's happening by looking through the rearview mirror. We look at the past. If you want to understand anything, you have to look at the past. We do not have the notion of looking, if you will, through the windshield. Direction, purpose. Now, this is what Dan pulls together. As Dan himself has taken a look at, and he does use the notion of looking through the rearview mirror in terms of where we've come from. And as I follow this, the model back, it really goes back to the Big Bang Theory with a general theory of organization reflected in evolution. And Dan observes that in evolution there were leaps in evolution which he's looking at. And that's his current area of focus. And it's kind of exciting in terms of what he's doing there. But he makes the observation now, in looking at some of the data, that there are leaps. And as man has now evolved, he has made some real leaps in evolution where he has been freed from efficient cause. The degree to which he is freed from efficient cause, gives him, it arrives at a new level and gives him, it puts him in the area of greater freedom. And here's where you have the notion of final cause and a subjective aim coming into play. But the key in that leap is learning. And now it is through learning that man is able to take hold, if you will, of his own ontological destiny and also operate in terms of creating social structures that can determine the general direction of evolution. And we are not simply now reacting in a deterministic way to efficient cause. And again, I come back to the point of when we're freed from efficient cause, that gives us higher degrees of freedom and responsibility, which introduces the whole concept of ethics, morality, and so forth. Can you see that? But I don't want to go into all of that. My purpose for discussing this is to introduce the concept of what I think is a grand discovery, which is the exemplar, which is the outstanding scientific achievement of this paradigm, which is learning. The ability to differentiate, to integrate, and generalize. And as Dan notes this, though that process of differentiation operates very clearly at the biological levels, as the various cells differentiate into nerve tissue or the various organs, you have differentiation and you have integration taking place. He, in his definition of learning, uses that concept of differentiation and integration which operate at the biological level. And when we come to the psychological level, we add the concept of generalization. That, I believe, is Dan's exemplar, which would be analogous to the exemplar in Newtonian physics of the forces equal to mass times acceleration, and the example that I used with Skinner of his Skinner box, and working with that. That, I think, has is a great scientific achievement, which is a key for any of us who are going to be working with this model as we work with youngsters. Learning is that key to the release of those potentialities. Okay. Now, the grand discovery, if it is to lead to a paradigm status is turned into method. And that's a major concern of mine now, are what are the methods for research and evaluation that are consistent or congruent with this paradigm. Now, as I noted in the mechanistic paradigm, the basic method, the basic methodology that was used was the breaking down a problem into independent and dependent variables, looking for the cause and effect relationships, the unilateral or the causal chain-like cause and effect relationships that exist, which are very consistent with the mechanistic view of the world. And I want to note here that this Dan's model does not do away with or eliminate or say that they are wrong. It simply puts them in a different perspective. Yes, there are relationships at certain levels, particularly the physical and some biological levels, where we can study nature using that methodology. There are cause and effect relationships that can be characterized under efficient causation. But as I pointed out in the anomalies, there are other kinds of causation now, where you are dealing with man as not a reactive organism only, but man as a proactive or an active organism based upon Whitehead or Leibniz notion. You now need to take into account other kinds of causation. And the methodology that will be more consistent and appropriate to the Anisa paradigm is concerned with what I would call reciprocal causation. Reciprocal causation. I cited some of the material from Bandura's concept of reciprocal causation, where you have to take into account the person, the behavior, and the environment, and the reciprocal relationship that exists there. Related to the causality here, also in terms of methodology, the concept of reciprocal causation, is the other notion that is an anomaly for the mechanistic paradigm, and is the concept of organized complexities. Organized complexities. You see, in the mechanistic, you are dealing with the machine notion that any part is interchangeable with any other part. And if you, from a scientific point of view, the mechanistic scientific point of view, if you broke down the elements and you knew what the cause and effect relationships were, these could be applied in all time, all space. It does not deal with the problem of the emergence of originality, novelty, or new creation. When you deal with the notion of organized complexities, you need a different methodology. You're dealing with a view of man that is in a process of change and emerging to higher levels of organization and integration. This is the essence of the organismic model. of man being an organic, living, structured system. I was thinking of this in terms of being and becoming. Being fits to a large extent much of the mechanistic paradigm. And being at all levels. You could take an atom, and the view there was the atom was essentially a stable, unchanging entity. And to try to understand that, we simply would understand its being. And this is the other anomaly that I was referring to that has created the crisis in social psychology, that science is not time independent. Because a social psychological experiment, when it's repeated, where the people have the information from it, they behave differently. You don't get the same degree of the criteria of the mechanistic, which is concerned with objectivity, prediction, and control. The physicists themselves have been concerned with this problem of understanding the atom. And current thinking right now is that the atom is not a stable, unchanging entity, that it remains the same throughout all time. It is in a state of being that is changing and also emerging and becoming. I'm using the atom as an example. Now, there are systems that can be fairly stable over a period of time and can fulfill the criteria of being relatively stable and unchanging, depending upon the sensitivity of the instruments or understanding of the entity that you're trying to understand. Am I communicating on this? Mm-hmm. But the underlying process, and that's the key to what Dan has keyed into here, is that even at that level of the atom, it is a relatively stable system, but it is also in a process of change. And that change may have direction even there. And this is the essence of taking it now at the living, at more organized complexities, the vegetable or animal or human level at the apex of development here. You have higher degrees of freedom, if you will. And again, getting back to the notion of organized complexities, you and myself, in terms of how the atoms have been flung together in terms of our uniqueness, are a highly organized complexity, and there is direction to that. This is the notion of final cause. So any method, any methodology now needs to take into account some of the issues that I'm raising here. The concept of reciprocal causality, the concept of organized complexity, and the emergence of novelty, which the mechanistic model simply cannot deal with. Let me just say, or use some examples from prior theory or theories that have existed that have been sensitive to some of the anomalies that existed in the mechanistic paradigm. From a theological point of view, Martin Buber was very tuned in to the notion that in his I-it relationship, which really characterizes the mechanistic notion, and this is what the problems exist in terms of using the experimental method in social psychology, which if we translate to education, we to that extent treat the students as objects. We are in an I-it relationship. For the legitimacy, for being legitimate under the mechanistic, you have to be objective and to be able to predict and control, and then try to quantify that in some way. And it was Buber's insight that when he was in an I-it relationship, he called that the eclipse of God. And when you moved into an I-thou relationship, where that's reciprocal, where you are in a relationship where you can change and I can change, and you see, I'm using this as an example of that. We have the same kind of problem that Harry Stack Sullivan, in his interpersonal theory of psychiatry, recognized. That what was happening, which is very similar in many ways to what Martin Buber was referring to, in trying to study what happened in a psychotherapeutic relationship between the therapist and a patient, which would be analogous in trying to study or evaluate or research what happens between a teacher and a pupil. The basic design under the mechanistic was to be objective and try to get an objective means of evaluating the outcomes and what was taking place. And the classic designs that we impose there are, as I referred to, out of Stanley and Campbell, of the double-blind, the matched group, the control group, and then making comparisons. Harry Stack Sullivan was quite clear that the data for his interpersonal theory of psychiatry was related to participant observation, not the neutral observer. That the only way you can understand what is happening in the therapeutic relationship is to take into account the participant observation. My own analysis was very much Salvanian, and the data that we were looking at was what was happening in the situation, which could not really be understood in any way by a neutral outside observer. The other theoretical framework that gives us some clues as to the kinds of method or methodology that's necessary to evaluate or research the subject matter of education, taking into account the elements that I've been referring to, is Piaget. The Genevan group, with the kind of methodology that they use there, has been referred to as the clinical method. Attempts to use the mechanistic methodologies to verify or disprove some of Piaget's have been very unsuccessful, because they attempt to set up in an objective way by getting a neutral observer without intervening in the process. And the results have been less than satisfactory in either direction. You see, it would not fit the good methodology. It would not be a tight method nor acceptable method, because for Piaget, he has to stop and ask the youngster where the youngster is. And you see, that doesn't fit any of our typical designs that get your work published in the more prestigious educational journals. Now, the effects of Piaget's research have been monumental in terms of finding, but they have not been legitimized under the mechanistic. Now, a point that I want to make here is, if you have a new paradigm, the paradigm itself determines the kind of method or the kind of legitimate methodology that you're going to use. And as Kuhn points out, when you are looking at the world through a given paradigm, a given worldview, and another person is looking at it through another paradigm, another worldview, you have paradigm differences. And he indicates that these are incommensurable. You're really talking through each other. You have two very different views. And that is amply clear as you look at the people who view Piaget's work through the mechanistic. It simply is not holding water there. The point that I'm trying to make, it is important, and I'm indicating that Piaget, Werner, I guess I would even put Sullivan and direction that Gadlin is moving. These are a cluster of theorists or theories that would fit under the organismic paradigm. And differences that might exist between them are inter-theory differences, but not inter-paradigm differences. Let me give several illustrations out of many. Let me take the problem that exists in the behavioral sciences concerning the nature-nurture problem. And Anastasia thought that was a dead issue a number of years ago, that we are no longer concerned. That was an issue that simply died away. It has not. It is very much alive and kicking today. The work of Jensen and so forth is how much is hereditary, how much is environment. That is still very much alive. Now, the questions that are raised in the nature-nurture issue under the mechanistic paradigm, and in terms of the method that would be used for trying to resolve or trying to solve those puzzles, is which one and how much. Which one, is it hereditary and environment, and how much? Those are the issues, and then you make your research designs trying to answer those questions. However, if you take that problem and put it in an organismic framework, and let me use Piaget as an example, those questions are meaningless questions. Meaningless questions. Because for Piaget, what you have in terms of causation, you deal with the material causes, which is the genetic and biological factors that are brought to bear, which are brought to bear in terms of the environment through assimilation. What operates in the environment then are the efficient causes that the environment brings to bear. And what you're concerned with is interaction, is the interaction. It's not which one and how much. These are simply false issues. They simply are not legitimate questions. Because for Piaget, there is the interaction between the material causes and the efficient causes which are brought to bear, which also then lead to, if you will, the formal and final causes. And as I referred to this earlier, in order to understand that problem, Piaget does not exclude the notion of efficient causation. It's very much evident. It's a very necessary cause or causation to deal with. But it is necessary but not fully sufficient. In order to have the sufficient explanation, you need to take into account formal, and that is structure, because out of the interaction, the assimilation and accommodation and equilibration process that takes place, you have the formal, the structures that develop, the schemas. But to have a sufficient explanation for this, you then need to take into account purpose or final cause. Now you see, if the methods that you would use and the way in which you raise the questions under the mechanistic, which is the nature-nurture problem, and the kinds of experimental designs that you would use to answer those questions simply do not exist or are dead issues in terms of this paradigm. I'll use that as an example of where the methodology that you use is very much related to the paradigm, and the paradigm, again, raises what are the legitimate problems and the legitimate methodology that is to be used in answering the questions raised by the paradigm. Okay. Let me use another example, which I've referred to earlier, and under the mechanistic paradigm, we're concerned with that sequence of objectivity, prediction, and control, and with attempts to quantify that process. Much of the research that has been conducted in the behavioral sciences with respect to the objectivity component, how do you measure in an objective way changes or the effects of a particular treatment or the effects of a particular influence. And here's where much of the current practice or methodology relies on normative tests. And just a quick word again about that. The underlying assumptions of normative testing is based upon a disorganized complexity, where you can use a statistical approach for conceptually mapping how reality works. And the statistical approach is Fisher's unit normal curve. That methodology and those means can still be used under this paradigm. We're not ruling that out. The important thing I would like to point out is that it is a special case. It is a special case of how reality works, and not essentially in touch with the basic reality. Let me flesh that out. It measures change in terms of a cross-sectional measure, but it does not measure change in terms of change of the individual against himself. The other broader problem that we have here is in that the problem of nomothetic versus idiographic issue that exists in the field. The normative tests are related to the nomothetic approach, and that dominates the behavioral sciences and particularly education today. It does not deal very well with the idiographic notions. To be able to conceptually map the idiographic, the uniqueness of the individual as he evolves into this organized complexity, will require some new approaches. I think I referred to the analogy between Newton and Einstein. The kind of mathematical system that Newton used to conceptually map matter in motion was Euclidean. That's quite analogous now, or at least I'm making the analogy here, that for us to understand the nomothetic approach, we are using statistical, particularly Fisher's statistics, to be able to map that change. And to a large extent, as did people under the mechanistic or Newtonian paradigm, took this as reality. To a large extent, I find educators and psychologists today taking this view of normative testing as a picture of reality. And this is a map of change which are inappropriately used in terms of trying to understand the youngster over time, or the way, even the ethical issues that are involved in intervening in a person's life into their privacy, making decisions about them on the tests, and determining their education by the tracking, creaming, and streaming process that we use. There are a whole range of problems and issues that are involved here that we need to deal with. But again, that analogy, Einstein needed to use Riemann's tensor calculus as the mathematical system to conceptually map his relativity theory of space-time and matter and energy. And that gave us a very different view of reality. It's a whole paradigm shift. I think we have something quite analogous here in terms of a paradigm shift. And this is what Dan's model is able to do. It does incorporate the other. We can still have that degree of objectivity. It can be used for a variety of purposes. But it is a special case, just as Newton's terrestrial and celestial laws were special cases in a larger conceptual framework. I think it puts that in perspective. It also raises the problem of that needs to be solved, and is one of the problems that the paradigm faces as it moves into the normal science phase of a new paradigm. A lot of workers will need to spend a lot of time, probably comparable to the kind of time that was spent in developing the technology of normative tests. And we may have a similar timeline with respect to the development of that. Now, the other kinds of methods that can be used, probably in the field today, general systems theory, and I've alluded to this before, which really represents that whole movement theoretically, which is very consistent with the organismic paradigm, and that is the concept of, instead of entropy, you have the concept of negative entropy, which is an organized complexity, and it's a process that tends toward higher levels of organization and integration at all levels. Very consistent with Anisa and with the organismic paradigm. That probably will be a key method or methodology that can be used and is available. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can draw upon that. That is available for the laws of organization, and there is already a large body of research and theory in the field. Much of that, unfortunately, is related to what's happening in at the physical level. That information theory, communication theory has been very productive in creating the computers and analogs, and it's highly used in weapons systems in terms of circular, causal, and feedback processes at that level. Now, the application of this to higher levels, and particularly human level, I think are very germane, and it's a body of theory that we can draw upon and use as a basis for designs that need to be developed consistent with Anisa. In fact, our own field testing of Anisa in Suffield and our current project, Inspire, the evaluation design that we have there is, to a large extent, using the general systems approach. It's a goal evaluation model. Goal in a sense that we are not simply looking for efficient causes, as Scravane would have it, and using and to see what happened. We consciously designed our goals, very consistent with what Anisa asks for, because there is purpose. And we establish the purposes, and now, based upon purpose, we are using as the methodology here of a goal evaluation model. We're now designing means to evaluate the degree to which we are approximating our goals or the ideal that we have set up. And we're using that in an operations research and the general systems approach. General systems approach in the sense that we can focus on systems of various sizes. We can focus on the individual, we can focus on the group, we can focus on the organization. And each of these then are higher level, and there is a totality, and we have to then evaluate the interrelationships of the parts and the relationships of the parts to the whole, which is the key underlying concept that we have here, where the whole is equal to more than the sum of the parts. And this scheme over here, let me refer to that now. The bedrock, the whole approach here in the Anisa frame is a theory of evaluation. And you can see the various arrows. The first arrows are really concerned with empirically, continuously and empirically testing the philosophical base, those first principles. But the point that I would like to make here in terms of method, that there is an integral relationship between a theory of administration and a theory of evaluation. And the theory of administration, which is, if you will, under general systems, creating a new organic system. There's a new creation that is being developed. And if it's going to have an empirical base, the line here from the theory of administration to the theory of evaluation, I would characterize as a reciprocal one, or a circular causal and feedback process. We establish goals. We now then establish means and procedures for evaluating empirically whether in fact we are achieving those goals. We use that feedback to then alter the direction in which we want to go. We're not just reacting to efficient causation here. We are, if you will, determining our own destiny, not only for the individuals, but for the social organization. Okay. Some other kinds of approaches as far as method is concerned. Yuri Bronfenbrenner has, in the American Psychologist, July '77, developed a very elaborate a method and approach. He calls it Toward an Experimental Ecology of Human Development. He has these developed into a number of definitions. Let me just read the first definition. The ecology of human development is the scientific study of the progressive mutual accommodation throughout the lifespan between a growing human organism and the changing immediate environments in which it lives. As this process is affected by relations obtaining within and between these immediate settings, as well as the larger social context, both formal and informal, in which the settings are embedded. And he has a very elaborate system, which is, I'm just bringing to your attention, that is very consistent and congenial with this. And I will draw, I think Anisa can draw heavily upon work that is being done in this field. I think Konrad Lorenz, just citing him as an example of the ethologists, the techniques that ethology uses in natural settings are very congenial and appropriate. I'm simply citing now a few of the kinds of methodology that are appropriate and consistent with the Anisa paradigm. Okay. Now, if Anisa is a new paradigm, the grand discovery is turned into method, and I've referred to some of the kinds of methods or methodology that is appropriate for the organismic paradigm based upon the notion of active man or proactive organism rather than the reactive. We also have theory. And here, very quickly, Dan has organized knowledge and organized this into his various sub-theories. His theory of development, which is integral or related to the theory of curriculum and theory of pedagogy, including theory of administration and theory of evaluation. He has, and as Dan points out, science is more than method. It's more than knowledge. It's organized knowledge. And to that degree, Dan has really fleshed out a theoretical structure. Those theories, and I'm referring to theories, although there's a single one here, need to assimilate old facts. And I think I've given you some of the illustrations of the assimilation of many of the research findings that exist in the field under the mechanistic paradigm. And I want to re-emphasize that DANS represents a paradigm shift, and the paradigm shift with the introduction of subjective aim and final cause incorporates and handles the material and efficient causes, but also accounts for the formal and final causes that, again, make it a paradigm shift, which can assimilate the old. So it does not, and again, I come back to that's the best analogy that I have, that it does not disprove the mechanistic findings and that whole body of research that exists there. And Dan has drawn very widely on that, or very heavily on that, because the theory of development to a large extent is empirically rooted on many of the mechanistic studies that exist in the field. So he's not disproving it. He is not saying it is incorrect. He is saying that they're necessary, and in my terms, but not sufficient. What is now being offered are the necessary and sufficient factors, and the sufficient factors, I think, are very much related to Dan's notion of subjective aim and final cause. So the process then would lead and will generate new applications and small discoveries. But it is, and as I'm saying, a new paradigm. We're at the beginning stages. It's really moving education to a paradigm stage, possibly a dual paradigm stage. And I say dual paradigm stage because the only other paradigm, and I'm being a little redundant here, that exists as a paradigm is the mechanistic. The mature sciences, all the mature sciences, typically move move to a level where they have a dual paradigm, competing paradigms. Psychology, to a large extent, is multiple paradigm at this point, multiple paradigm. It's still not a dual paradigm stage. When you do move to a dual paradigm stage, then you have competing paradigms, and then these can be worked through. But to use Kuhn's framework, you have the new applications, new small discoveries, and then you move to the discovery of anomalies now. And I'm saying that Dan's model, at some point, if this is the process, will encounter anomalies. Now, his system, to a large extent, simply because there is a built-in circular process to attempt to take into account changes, is quite flexible, and it may exist for some time. But it is possible. And if Kuhn's framework and perspective is correct, anomalies will begin to appear and will then emerge into a theoretical crisis. An observation that I alluded to before, but let me make again, is, and since we've been drawing very heavily on Piaget, and Piaget's notion of intelligence, his epigenetic view, I see some parallels here that Lovinger and others have seen, so it's not completely original with me, but I'd like to point it out, and it seems to make some sense, and I'd like to share it, is that this perspective, which is the Kuhnian perspective, is somewhat analogous to Piaget's stages of development. For example, when the youngster is at the grasping, sucking stage, he's assimilating, accommodating, and he develops that schema. He uses that schema and applies it to every problem. In other words, he picks up everything and he puts it in his mouth, whether it be his bottle or a thumbtack, and it could be that dangerous. He imposes that schema on everything. And everything that is not within that schema simply doesn't exist. It's either too much novelty or he simply does not pay attention to it. Can you see the analogy that I'm trying to make there? Is that a paradigm puts blinders on you. It's like Piaget's schema. And we apply it to everything. And I think this is what we've done with the mechanistic paradigm. This is what Gadlin is referring to. That problem of the experimental approach. We've now applied the method to every problem. And the method really determines what's going to be studied. That old example that you've heard, a man losing his watch, drunk, and he's under the street light. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I'm looking for my watch." And he said, "Well, where did you lose it?" And he said, I lost it over there, but this is the only place that there's light." So he's looking for it in the light. It's a crude example, but you see, in my own training, it was when I studied, as I alluded to my experience with Piaget, with Heinz Werner, and my early exposure to Piaget, which triggered something in me, and then my training at Columbia, which was within that mechanistic paradigm. I went to control groups. My first studies were in sensory tonic theory, the differences between male and female running a t-test. And then the problems of statistics, we got into analysis of variance, analysis of covariance. That method then, you found problems that could fit into that, and you did your dissertation in that. So we use the method, which is quite analogous to Piaget's notion of schema, which then we apply to everything. But that's good, and I think this is exactly what happens with I'm making a value judgment, this is what happens to a paradigm. A paradigm now puts blinders on you to that extent that here's reality, and it goes through the normal science phase, and it really fleshes out every problem. It's very productive that way. The degree to which it solves a lot of problems makes its contribution. Newton has made a major contribution, there's no question about it. But it then moves into creating anomalies, problems, again, that the schema cannot deal with. And you have this crisis. And I'd like to pursue that a little bit further, and I will do taking it within Piaget's notion of how you shift through that period of equilibrium. And this is exactly perhaps where we're going right now. We have the theoretical crisis out of the mechanistic. We have a new paradigm. We'll go into the normal science phase with all of the work that has to be done there. And the work then is really determining what are the facts that we have to deal with. Developing these with greater precision in terms of the kinds of instrumentation that is necessary. And we're really concerned now for the kinds of evaluation that we'll need for understanding the youngster, and particularly the process curriculum. It's opening issues and problems that need to be dealt with here. Another point in terms of that normal science phase and I want to bring it to our attention not to be discouraged too quickly if we're not getting quick empirical data to support the theory. And I alluded to this before, of a broad paradigm, a theory of broad scope and generality. You do not always get clear empirical evidence over the short run that something is there. And I mentioned Einstein's, where there are only 4 real, clear, empirically based evidence that his general theory of relativity is true. But look at what it has accomplished. We should not be premature in making evaluations on short-term outcomes and abandoning this. I think it's very important for us to take that large perspective and to understand the gap of collecting good empirical data for testing a theory of broad generality. So, I'm not sure I have any conclusion. This is a process. The essential point that I tried to make here is that Anisa represents a new paradigm under the organismic view. That paradigm will, to a large extent, determine the kind of methodology that will be necessary to be able to evaluate the kinds of new data that we're concerned with, that the paradigm points out to us that are important and essential. Werner and Piaget did trigger something very important to me. And now the Anisa paradigm does answer my basic question: what does it mean to be intelligent with respect to personal and social change? It is the most elegant solution that I know. This is the vineyard in which I'm going to be spending the rest of my career.